And we're live. How's everyone doing? Tai C, greeting comrades. I see, we see which side you've taken on this debate. Welcome everybody to the great debate. For those here for the first time, this is not the place where you're going to see two people working to defeat one another, rather two people coming together to find common ground on the most important issues we face. That's what the great debate is all about. That's what we're here to do. The topic of today's conversation is a debate that has been going on for nearly a century. Capitalism versus socialism. If you've watched the news or listened to our politicians, you have been given a simplistic, unnuanced version of this debate. Today, we're going to take a deep dive, a nuanced, in-depth conversation. Neither of our guests is going to make the case for either a pure capitalist or a pure socialist system. Rather, the debate is what the healthy balance between these two systems is, what the healthy balance between the public and private sectors. That's what we're here to do. To anyone who's joining us, feel free to have a lively discussion in the chats. We'll also be taking audience questions at the end, so ask questions and let us know where in the world you're viewing from. It's great to have you all here. I'm very happy to introduce our two guests. Hold on. Bringing him on. Matthew, let's see your name up. To my bottom left, Yoram Symons. Actually, both of our guests today are from down under, two Aussies, as they say in Australia. This is coincidental, but, you know, it's interesting that we have two Aussies on the show, one making the case for capitalism, the other for socialism. It's going to be interesting. On my bottom left, I'm very happy to introduce Yoram Symons, who is a multi-disciplinary artist and a performer, synthesizing spoken word, storytelling, poetry, writing, emerging technologies, ritual, and Kaballah. He's an Australian Poetry Slam State finalist, Melbourne Spoken Word Prize finalist, and three-time winner of the Grounded Battle of the Arts Spoken Word Competition. Welcome, Yoram.
Hi. Thank you.
And on my bottom right, we have Matt Mckenzie, who's a journalist at the Western Australian media outlet, Business News. He is involved in a number of local nonprofits and has recently started his own YouTube channel, Matt's Money Matters, which you can find a link to that in the... Oh, is Matt not here? We lost Matt. Matt's coming back. You can actually find a link to Matt's YouTube channel in the description, as well as contact info for Yoram, as well as my own contact information. At any time, feel free to get in touch with either myself or any of our guests. We're all happy to engage in dialogue after the debate is over. So, welcome, Matthew. Let's just get your name on the screen so people can see. We are, as always, having technical...
Am I working? My tech is not perfect. Is it going okay? Or?
Yeah, right. I mean, I hear you well. I hear you well. I see you well. Let me just make sure that we're also
no promises that it'll stay that way.
Yeah, no, I know. No guarantees. Awesome. Cool. Technical difficulties has become the norm. 2020, you'd think we'd be past these little technical road bumps, but we're not quite there yet. Hopefully by 2040, I wonder if it will take the private sector or the public sector to get us to the point where we could do these seamless discussions. Let's dish it out. So we're going to start by understanding where both our guests stands on the spectrum of capitalism and socialism. So Yoram, let's start with you. Welcome.
Hi. Sure. Okay. So my views can pretty much be summed up as human beings have always acted as communities, and everything we do is done through a prism of community. And although we often are told things like we're individuals, we actually act as communities, whether that's at a tribal level or currently, I suppose, at a nation state level or even at a global level. And so because the way in which we're doing and achieving is through community and through the aggregation of human beings together, then for me, the most logical and fair way that society should run is that the group should have access to the wealth that it's creating. And so the system that we're currently in, generally characterized as capitalism, is where all the work of those huge groups, which at the moment number in the billions of people, is all sort of sucked up and taken by a very, very few people. And to me, it just seems that the more both logical and fair way of distributing wealth is that the people that create the wealth should have access to the wealth. And since all wealth is created through the community and all of its activities combined together, it is the community that should be benefiting from what it's producing. And that's more or less, in a nutshell,
Great, thank you.
Where I stand.
Short and to the point. Thank you, Yoram. Matt, all you.
Well, I'm excited to be here, and I hope my internet connection survives my ramble. But I was going to say, give me a signal if I disappear, but it won't work, will it?
I'll hit
Let
you
me
up
tell you a
on
bit about
WhatsApp.
me personally. You'll hit me up on WhatsApp. Well, that makes sense. I'll tell you about me personally. I grew up with a single mum, and she was quite sick for a portion of my childhood, and we were quite reliant on welfare. And a lot of people that grow up in that sort of background often become big believers in socialism. But I was passionate about, how I could make change and improve those sorts of circumstances, and I studied economics. And what I think the key lesson is that countries that move towards free markets progress. They have improvements in living standards, and countries that move away from free markets slow down or go backwards. Now, one of the things about this debate is we've got to be in good faith. And I reckon, Yoram, that you and I can agree on a few things, to be honest with you. I think we can both agree that the system that provides the best living standards for people is the best system. A system that creates opportunity for everyone to contribute and get something out of it is the best system. A system that gets a good outcome for people that are vulnerable is a good system, and a system that can protect the environment. And I think over the past few decades around the world, as more countries have moved towards sort of free markets and liberal democracy, there have been hundreds and hundreds of millions of people that have been lifted out of extreme poverty. I was at an event a couple of years ago with the Chinese Deputy Consul General to Perth. And one of the things she said, I was very surprised by this, and perhaps not something that they'd say right now, but she said that as China liberalized its economy, that was the big reason that they've been able to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China. So even a Chinese government representative cited liberalization and free markets as one of the big things that delivered benefits for the people there. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to make our society better and to eliminate poverty, but free markets are doing a very good job so far.
Great. So you guys presented something slightly different, but I actually think that there's definitely a way to bridge this. And I think that it's essentially what many Western nations are attempting to do, despite not well enough in my opinion. But Yoram wants workers to get a fair share, because without them, the entire industry wouldn't exist. So, for example, right now in COVID times, we're seeing essential workers. We're seeing it's not the CEOs who are delivering food to people. It's everyday people who are making sure that we don't go to bed hungry. Now, again, that doesn't mean there's no role for the CEO, but the average individual is essential in the means of production, so they should get a fair share. And Matt, what you're saying is that free markets produce growth, produce wealth, but it seems like these things are not mutually exclusive, right? We can achieve a system where workers are getting their fair share, but we have, enough freedom for individuals to create businesses and to transact with one another that we can create growth. Do you guys see these as two inherently incompatible ideals? This is a question for both, whoever wants to take it.
Yoram, do you want to go? Or?
Yeah, I don't see them as being fundamentally incompatible. Like back to like my original statement, in as much as humans are communities, humans are also individuals. And I think that these two like modalities of human operation are they're hard coded. And so the system has to appreciate both individual and collective simultaneously. And there certainly seems to be, you know, a huge benefit to allowing people to start businesses and do things, you know, so to speak, on their own. I don't think like centrally planning an economy certainly hasn't worked yet. And I can't foresee exactly when it might be able to work and under what conditions it might be able to work. So I mean, I can't deny that there's a role of free markets. What I would say is that there's more to do with people being lifted out of poverty by technology than by free markets. And that the way I see it is that it's really technology that's the big story of the 20th and now 21st centuries. It's been propagandized as free markets, but I don't really think that's the cause of what's happened. And most of the big tech is funded by government, more or less, and only comes to free market after it's been very, very developed, and so that it can cope in market conditions, which really aren't, they're really not conducive to the development of really important things, you know, because markets want to see profits on a quarterly basis. And if you want to develop something like the internet, it might take 40 years, which is what, 160 quarters before you'll see profit. Something like Siri. So the tech behind Siri was developed by DARPA over something like 30 years. And then only when it was finally ready to go, did it get licensed out to Apple to go to the real market, go to the public market, so to speak. And so this idea that it's free markets that are lifting people out of poverty, I just think it's mistaken. I think it's technology that lifts people out of poverty, and technology has come about through more of the public spending and work done in universities than actually the private sector itself. Not that there isn't a role for private sector in technology, but I don't think it's the whole story by any stretch. And it's interesting that a delegate from China said that, but yeah, just because they're from China doesn't mean that they fully understand necessarily what's going on in their own country per se.
Well, to be fair, she's a spokesperson for the Chinese government, so it's not like she's. And I reckon Chinese government spokespeople are more careful than most when it comes to towing the line. But I take your point.
Yeah, no. I mean, you know, like it's neither here nor there, but it's cool that she said that.
But so actually, since we're on the topic of China, it's actually what China did and why they were successful is kind of similar, Yoram, to what you mentioned, because they still consider themselves, you know, the Communist Party of China, but in many ways they're capitalist. Yeah, so they kind of have a hybrid. If you're Chinese, you could start a business. It's just that the government at any point can say, all your data is mine, right? It's so they still have full control over the company if they wish, but they give people the freedom to create companies. So you kind of have, you know, in a sense, capitalism, but also with very strong central control. But it seems
I think a big part of why China moved to that model was to bring in international capital. Like the Soviet model, the Soviet Union couldn't bring in international capital for all sorts of reasons, but there wasn't much international capital flowing into the Soviet Union. China, you know, realized that being able to bring in capital was going to be a big benefit. And so by liberalizing, you know, okay, so here's where like understanding socialism and capitalism sort of ideal systems kind of falls down, because they both exist in an actual real world with an actual history. And the capitalist nations are really the European nations that attained a certain level of technology over the course of the last 500 years that enabled them to basically conquer the world and set the terms of it. And so it's to me, it's less free markets that have driven this than pure naked imperial aggression and the power that technology that has brought to bear on things.
Well, let's go over a few things. Take a few steps back just to go over what you said. Firstly, you know, with the example of China, it's intriguing that you say how important attracting capital was for the Chinese government, attracting international investment, which I think goes to part of the point that free market systems can create a circumstance where investment comes in and happens. But just to go a little bit further back to the original question, I appreciate your point that workers play an essential role and they should get their fair share. But how do we define a fair share exactly? Like, a fair share seems like a very subjective thing, and I'm sure this is something we'll explore over the course of the episode. How we determine what makes a fair share is very subjective. And of course, right, that it's right for some level of action from society to make sure that everybody gets a certain level of living standards. That's very important. But determining what's a fair share is very difficult. As to what you said earlier about the chief executive making lots of money, but he's not actually delivering the groceries. Yep, that's very fair. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about, Jeff Bezos and some of those people like that. I think it's a little bit more complicated than just to say, the CEO has a lot of money and that doesn't seem very fair. I'm sure we'll get into it.
I personally don't care about the CEO's compensation. What's more important to me is the investor class. The fact that CEOs are making silly times what the workers make is problematic, but the CEO is doing something. Like businesses can't exist without management. And so you need, you need management structures and management layers, and how you compensate managers. Like, should they be compensated more than workers? I don't think so. But even if you do think so, I don't think they should be compensated at the kind of rate they are. Like here in Australia, the CEO of Qantas is making like in the tens of millions, something like that.
That's an exaggerated estimate from that report, but go on.
Right, you know what I'm referring to.
It's still a lot. I get your point.
Yeah, that came up recently. And workers are making, significantly less than that. But my real issue is with capitalists, i.e. people that just own capital and can bring capital into businesses. Now, all they contribute is capital. They don't contribute knowledge. They don't contribute management. They don't contribute skill. They contribute capital. And it's that capital.
Can you give an example, Yoram? Can you give an example?
Well, okay, you float a company on the stock market. Why? Because you need to raise capital. All businesses need money, right? They both need money from the market, and they need money usually from a bank, because you're always running. You're almost every business in the world lags behind their obligations, so they need some capital injection just to pay their wages and their bills and their power and their inputs. And then whenever they want to grow and expand, they're going to need like big injections of capital to do that, whether that's building a new factory or designing a new product, or however a company wants to grow. And so the only place on earth to get capital from is from big pools of capital that either come from the market or from banks, or in some cases governments issuing debt. But it's that capital is where I am like at odds with the system. Like CEO compensation for me is like, yeah, they shouldn't be making that much, but it's kind of like a minor part of what's going on. What's really going on is
just to clarify, so the reason I asked for clarification is, in capital in this instance, you meant actual cash money. I wasn't sure if you're referring to property or machinery, which some people would consider capital as well. But
all of that is capital, but under the current system, the only way to get any of that stuff is with money, right? Everything's priced in money, right? So if you want plant, machinery, equipment, or even to buy labor or rent labor, however you want to frame it, in our system, that's cash. I mean, maybe you can turn up with bars of gold.
What that means, though, when you say it requires cash, what that means is you have to give someone something in order to get the property or the equipment or get the capital, right? A worker and someone else has to get capital to make the thing. You're having a coffee shop, you need to pay for a pizza oven because someone had to make it in the first place. So yeah, you need the money in order to buy capital, but that doesn't change, right? Depending on the ownership structure of society, whether it's owned by worker collectives or owned by the government, you still have to pay for capital. But the point I just wanted to make there, you spoke about. I found it interesting. You spoke about how important capital was to society, how it was critical to get stuff done, but you seem to believe that the people who contribute capital, they shouldn't be rewarded for it, or they're rewarded too much?
They shouldn't have it.
What's the view?
Capital should be publicly owned. There's no reason for individuals to own such vast amounts of things.
So let's break down what this means, right? So when you say capital should be publicly owned, do you mean the pizza oven in the shop, which is capital, should be publicly owned, or do you mean my house should be publicly owned? What do you mean when you say capital should be publicly owned?
What I specifically mean, I suppose, is that at the very least, there should be no private banking. That banking shouldn't exist at a profit, and that governments should be lending money out at virtually zero interest without making profit. And so you would, that's how, fundamentally capital should move. That really a handful of individuals, they call them the 1%, but it's really in actual reality, a much smaller figure than that, are controlling, let's get out of the word capital for a minute, vast sums of wealth that are tied up in investments in various ways, and they're in control of how that capital gets distributed around the world. And that to me makes no sense. That small group of investors control the most powerful levers that our civilization has, and in almost no cases did they work to get that money. There's very few that achieve those levels of capital allocation control in that way. This is where I just can't see how the capitalist system can be justified.
Okay. Well, I think you've fundamentally misunderstood something about how wealth is created. But there's a few things that I need to sort of go back to. So
yeah, go for it.
So we agreed that capital is important. You said the government should allocate it without any interest. You're in Victoria,
no.
as I understand.
Just in terms of banking, that banking shouldn't be privatized as one form of capital flow. Sure.
So you live in So you live in Victoria. There's a fabulous case study in Victoria in the 1980s and the early 1990s about the State Bank and about another bank called Tricontinental. And there's a similar study in South Australia. There's a similar example in Western Australia. State banks that lend out money on the basis of basically good feels without any regard to profit are almost always totally disastrous. China's a good example here, right? There's always this concern that there's going to be a massive banking crisis in China because Chinese banks lend out money without any sort of regard. So this is one of the big differences, I think, between where you and I are standing on this. So if a government is lending out money through a bank, and it's doing it without any regard to profit, what's Bank of Scott Morrison going to lend money to? He's going to lend money to all the stuff that he thinks is a cool idea. And it's not going to have very much, and the Bank of Anthony Albanese, those are Australian politicians, for those of you watching around in other countries. The Bank of Anthony Albanese might lend the money somewhere else, but they're going to be lending the money where they think it's a good idea without any discipline. So the reason that the capitalist system has got such impressive results is because if people allocating capital want to make a return and can make a return, then they will make good decisions. And if they make the bad decisions, they lose. And that's the sort of, and of course, it's not always perfect. And there are awkward circumstances. You don't think No, it's all right. But what I'm saying is, for the most part, if you allocate capital badly, you lose. You don't get it back. And that's not always the case. There are circumstances which are very extreme where that isn't the case, but generally speaking, if you make a bad capital allocation decision, you lose. There's an example of an Australian company that tried to open a hardware store in the UK. They burned up $1 billion, basically, or £1.5 billion that they'll never get back. But you go.
Wait,
no, I was just going to say,
sorry, one follow-up, Matt. So, as you just explained, that essentially what the profit and investment banks makes, it aligns the incentives between those providing the capital and those who are running the businesses. It incentivizes them to make good decisions. But so, for example, in the United States, when the banks failed, the government bailed them out. So would you agree that we shouldn't have a system like that because then the risk isn't real, right? They're like, they could take all the risk they want, and they just know you know,
see all that
the U.S. government would spend more money and
banking crisis. And I mean, this is something that Marx was pointing out, is that banking crises are endemic to capitalism. They're not bugs, they're features, so to speak. And so capitalism appears to work until it doesn't, and then it will be bailed out, and then it will appear to work until it doesn't, and then it will be bailed out, and then it will appear to work until it doesn't, and then it will be bailed out, which is why, like, for me, this kind of financial system isn't really the wealth generator of society. What's really going on is knowledge and technology. And yes, that is funded, because everything has to be funded, but knowledge and tech is funded at that government level. You know, the internet was funded by the government. Computer microchips was a program out of one of the big unis in the United States, I can't remember which one, that eventually turned into the company Intel. But had it not had its start with military grants through the university system, there wouldn't be microchips as we know them. And only once they were, you know, babysat into maturity, then they were allowed to go out into the market, again, controlled by the market, so to speak. And so this idea that the kind of financial disciplines you're talking about are better, in some frames they are, but then there's frames where that whole system falls apart. Everybody needs a bailout, and then you start from scratch again, kind of showing that you need this big government last resort lender to backstop the entire system.
Okay, so a few points there. Firstly, you keep saying we're going back to the start again, but we're not really when there's a crisis. I mean, we're still, our living standards are much better than they were a few decades ago. And we'll talk about technology. We'll get back to technology in a minute, okay? But you know, so we're not starting from scratch, regardless of whether you think it's the technology, just the tech, or whether you think it's a whole range of other things. We're not starting from scratch again. Society has, living standards in society have improved dramatically in countries that are free market countries, and in countries that are free market countries, and in those countries that are not free market countries. Am I sorry? Have I broken? I can't see.
No, you're good.
Okay. In countries that are not free market countries, and I think of there's lots of examples in Africa and in some parts of Asia. There are countries where they go free market for a period, living standards improve, and then they don't, and then living standards go backwards or they stagnate. And there's examples of that in Europe too. Sweden is a good example there. But I want to go back to your question, because we're diving around a lot here about the GFC. You said, is it right that banks are bailed out during the GFC? Don't forget that the US government set up a system, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the rules of the financial system, to encourage banks to lend to make subprime mortgages. The Community Investment Act or Reinvestment Act, or whatever the heck it was called, in 1974, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac were government organizations. So the government had a massive role in encouraging banks into subprime mortgages. Now, should we bail out banks when they make mistakes? There's got to be a way. Sorry.
Sorry. Continue.
Well, I'm not blaming the entire GFC on that. I'm just incorporating that in. I'm just making sure the folks at home know that it wasn't just about banks being greedy. It was also about the government taking a very strong stance in trying to encourage subprime lending. But just in terms of what you're saying about the bailouts, I wouldn't have done it exactly how Bush and Obama did it. But there is I appreciate the point that if you have financial institutions collapse, it can have a massive impact on the rest of the economy. But you have to do it in a way where the investors who made the bad decisions aren't rewarded, but everywhere else doesn't end up punished. So it's not an easy thing. I understand what you're saying, but ultimately, I mean, you know, even if we go through financial crises, society is improving constantly, and we'll have to have the text discussion.
I agree, but I don't think that's a function of capitalism or the free market system. It's a function of technology. It's technology, and that's really the whole point, is that all the banks can crash. We still know how to build fridges. We still know how to build airplanes. We still know how to grow wheat. Nothing has actually happened. All that's happened is, like this is kind of the way I characterize the housing crisis in the US. Like, you still had houses. You still had people who needed houses. The only thing that was missing was money. So because money was sucked out of the system, people couldn't live in houses anymore. So you had houses that were empty and people living in their cars or living with relatives, even though all the actual material conditions of our civilization hadn't changed at all. And the same in the Great Depression. The Great Depression sucked money out of the system, so that causes businesses to go bankrupt, so that causes people to lose their jobs, so that causes them to not have money coming in and they can't spend it. But from a civilizational point of view, we were splitting atoms, we were inventing television, we were, from the true functioning of the civilization, the collapse of a financial market was irrelevant. And that to me is the point.
Firstly, the Great Depression, a lot of people think the Great Depression was about capitalism, but actually it was really about very bad central bank policy, which did exactly the words you said are actually eerily quite right. Sucked money out of the system. So again, that's a government institution that had a bad policy, and it didn't do it intentionally, right? They just didn't know back then that it was a bad idea, but because they had a gold standard and all sorts of other things, they reduced the money supply, and it made what would have been a very bad or a bad recession turn into a massive depression. But let's get back to the elephant in the room, which is this question about technology. Amazon investing billions every year in research and development without the government. Uber, Google, Facebook, Nokia Ericsson, Nokia and Ericsson, are they the same company? Who knows? There's lots of big businesses that invest in technology, and there's lots of small businesses as well that do research into technology. I have a small business that's doing some tech work. I understand you have a great interest in virtual reality. I assume the government doesn't fund that.
I used to work in tech, so I clearly there are companies doing stuff, but the foundational technologies, like the internet, for example,
internet's the one example you keep citing. Do you have any others other than the internet and microchips?
Microchips, the internet, Siri.
I know that there's an existing relationship. There's an existing relationship between the U.S. government and Silicon Valley. They're constantly looking for technologies, and then they'll either fund it or buy it. But again, I personally see this as what I would call a healthy balance, because we've, at least the way I see things, there's a benefit in capitalism is that it distributes the means of production and doesn't leave it in the hands of just the central authority. So there's more energy in more decentralized, places working to build, and then the government's kind of picking the ones that they see as beneficial and pouring more money into them. SpaceX, for example, is another great example. They get huge government subsidies just to try to, put people on Mars,
because they think a private company will do a better job than the government's NASA. That's why the government supports them.
I don't think that a government can do things in the way that companies can. I don't think the role of government is to take the place, plant companies. It's clear that companies are very good at making stuff. I'm not an advocate that companies should be dissolved and governments should run everything themselves. I think that is a bit silly. But let's
wait. We've got very good common ground already.
Yeah.
No.
This is very important common ground. We all agree that letting individuals compete and start their own businesses seems to be great for productivity and for building better technology. What the relationship between that company and the government is, well, that's yet to be resolved. Would you go through that?
One more thing. For every example you can give of a great tech that was developed with a bit of government support or a subsidy, there's a million examples that you've never heard of where the government spent money on stuff. There's one here in Western Australia, a wave energy farm, 16 million or something they did in a subsidy. It went kaput. The government spend lots of money granting lots of different research grants, and some of them, it's like throwing darts at a board. Some of them come up well, but I'm not sure if there's any. Happy to hear if there is, but I'm not sure there's any really serious evidence that suggests that government is better at developing technology, other than maybe in wartime.
It's not that it's better. The point is that,
or better at funding technology developments. If I'm not clear, sorry.
The way the market operates is that investors need to see profit these days on a quarterly basis, certainly on an annual basis.
That's just the
point I'm trying to make.
That's not right. It's not.
Let him finish his point. Let him finish his point.
Okay. there are certain technologies that might take decades in order to get them to a point where they're useful. And a company can't operate like that. Now, you've cited a few companies that have, like these enormous behemoths like Amazon and Google and so on. Now, this is where this sort of distinction between private and public starts to fall down, because all government really is a gigantic institution that has, or a gigantic organization that has certain powers. Now, other organizations can get that big. And we're seeing that now. Like, Amazon is bigger than many governments around the world. Google is bigger than many governments around the world. We're now in a phase where we're seeing these massive organizations. Now, when you are at that level of massiveness, you can start to do things that in other eras can only be achieved by governments. Because, again, it's not that government has any intrinsic thing. All it is a gigantic organization that has slightly different rules around the way that it works. So when you get a company that's just that massive, it can start to do things that are government-like. Now, that is where, why do we even have an idea that governments should be public? Because we've got a history that the governments used to be private. It used to just be the king, and the king did whatever the king wanted. And at some point, people said, it's not fair that the king controls everything that the king does, we want to say, and that manifested in various ways in England, in France, etc. And so we're now seeing companies get to a point of such insane amounts of power that it's no longer logical for them to be private in the way that they currently are. So, like, the fact that Amazon and Apple and Google can do these crazy things, that's just, well, they've hit such a massive level that they're behaving in many ways like governments.
So the first point is that only governments can fund really interesting technology development. And now the point is, well, no, actually some companies can do.
It's not that, no, the point is that certain technologies need a lot of time to mature, and so they can't be exposed to market forces while they're maturing. They need to be babied, and sometimes that babying takes a long time. That's the point.
But the point underpinning your argument is that when I say capitalism creates massively good living standards, you're saying, well, actually, most of the technological developments that are really important are government funded. But I don't think we've seen a proof of that yet. We've seen the internet example, which of course originally was government funded, but who really developed the internet? I mean, the internet has come so far from when it was first used, to
that's my point.
Of research information by the private sector. So in terms of the development of that technology, even if the government had a very small role, the private sector did most of the development. So again, I go back to what I'm saying, which is having free markets and having private companies driven by profit motives is what's getting the results. Even if there's little bits of government intervention along the way,
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. But let's talk about something completely different, which is that I'm not an economist, so I can't, there's certain parts of this discussion that I'm out of my depth. Where I want to go to is, one, like happiness in general, and then B, like, in a purely economic sense, some of your arguments are obviously, tight. But that comes at a cost of, well, total environmental catastrophe, and let's just look at that one to start. Well, two, really. One is that capitalism is really built on the exploited labor of people, and that's how capital comes about, and how these private individuals can move capital here and there. And all you're really saying is that under the rules of the profit motive, the allocation of capital is more intelligent. Maybe, but where is that?
I'm saying definitely.
Well, maybe. But
guys, I just want to fairly
intelligently that one group can intelligently use their slave labor better than another group can isn't addressing the question of where does that capital come from in the first place? How is it created? And so where does it come from? How is it created? And then why should individuals be able to control it? And so all you're saying is we've got two ways of allocating capital, and one seems to be working better than another. Maybe, fair enough. But what is this capital? And it is coming out of ground. Most of that ground is stolen ground, and it's coming out of people, and most of that labor is exploitative. And so raising living standards, which again I think is I just don't think it's free markets that raise living standards. It's technology, and
which we've agreed is mostly funded by
because
we agreed is mostly promoted by private businesses.
The technology is water systems, technology is road systems, technology is housing. These things are infrastructure. The technology is not like mobile devices and virtual reality glasses. I mean, they're cute, but water systems, food systems, housing systems, electric grids. This is what we're really talking about with living standards. I mean, living standards is ultimately access to infrastructure. Huge, massive systems.
Matt, before you
happy to talk about that.
Matt, before you answer, because I do want us to move on to what Yoram alluded to, but I just want to summarize the areas of agreement and the contention here. It seems like there's an agreement that distributing the means of production has its benefits when it comes to growth. The disagreement comes in which capital is better, is that private capital or public capital in funding that distributed means of production. This is an area where we may not find common ground today, but it almost seems like we can acknowledge that distributing the means of production, letting people run companies as they wish, to some extent seems like a good idea. Can we all agree on that? To some extent, keyword.
Oh yeah, like I said, I don't think there's no roles for companies and no roles for private capital. Like it's clearly, I don't think there's no role for it. I just don't think it's the be all and end all, nor do I think it's the fundamental driver of increased quality of life in the world.
Right. So that takes us on to our next topic. We could partially, or for the most part, agree that capitalism is good for growth. Now the question is growth what we should value? And if we do value growth, how much should we value that compared to other things like environment, animal well-being, human well-being, or does growth involve all those things? Let's talk about this, what the value of growth is and should be in today's world, or in the world we want to build.
Okay. One quick wisecrack before we go on. I would say that the house I'm living in was definitely built with private capital, I think, but I'm just bantering. Just in terms of the environment, there's a lot of interesting research on this, and I think this idea that capitalism exploits the environment, I think, is fundamentally not really accurate. I mean, think about in the UK. For many decades, the coal mines were operated by the government. In lots of places in the world, there are coal mines operated by government. There are coal power stations here in WA. Almost all of them are owned by the government here in WA. The ones in Queensland are owned by the government.
So
the thing is,
can I talk to that point straight away?
Go for it.
So this is kind of where I was getting at, that it needs to be a wider argument. Like both capitalism and socialism as understood are just ways of running an industrial economy. And the argument is, what's the better way to run an industrial economy? Should there be more private or more public? To me, the industrial economy is the problem. So whether a coal mine's owned by the government or whether it's owned by private capital, it's a coal mine. It's pulling resource out of the ground that's unreplaceable or irreplaceable, and it's putting pollution out into the atmosphere, which may never be sequestered. And so whether that coal mine is run by a workers' collective or whether it's run by heartless, bloodthirsty capitalists, its fundamental functioning is the same, which is why the argument to me over what's the better way to run an industrial economy should be secondary to, we need to stop running an industrial economy and begin exploring a different way to organize economic life on the planet. because the industrial economy, whether it's private or public, is going to choke us all to death at some point.
Okay, let's go through a few things here. Firstly, I mean, there's lots of big companies that are targeting net zero carbon emissions, right? So when we say the industrial economy is going to choke us all to death, I'm very optimistic about the ability that society has to deal with climate change. I really am. I mean, you know, there's examples of companies investing in carbon sequestration, technology is improving. You know, there's people getting you know. Yeah, but the thing is, right? If we're, as you rightly point out, if we want to make sure we hit net zero by 2050 and not overshoot it, I think you sort of implied this. We're going to need negative emissions possibly at some point. We're going to need to try and take carbon out of the air. So sequestration is quite useful for that. So technology is developing apace, and it's interesting here in Australia and in America. It's like the governments are the ones that can't seem to get, when it's collective action, the governments seem to be the ones that can't get their house in order. Does Trump want to be in Paris or not? What's Australia's stance? And that's just when voters are sorry. I'll go for a bit. That's just when voters are voting on how to spend someone else's money. You know, if you go up to the workers' collective running a coal power station and say, "Sorry guys, you know, you've got to shut it down," I think you know, and you can compensate them, but you can compensate them in capitalism too, right? But it doesn't get to the crux of the problem. The problem of transitioning to sort of carbon neutrality or to lower emissions or whatever else economy, whether they're owned by the workers' collective or whatever owns the means of production, whether it be private people or the government, the problem is still the same, right? It's that we have assets like a coal-fired power station or a gas processing plant or whatever else. And if you shut those assets off, all of the value of those assets, all of the labor to build them, all of the equipment in them becomes nothing. Society loses that value. It just loses it. It doesn't go anywhere. It just disappears. And there's an important trade-off, right? There's absolutely a trade-off in that we need to cut emissions and we need to look after the climate, but it's not a free trade-off. It's what we're talking about when we talk about shutting down industries is we are talking about severely lowering people's living standards. Just kind of turning off all the coal-fired power stations in Australia, for example. Of course we could do it, but the amount of wind and solar power and batteries we would need to replace them with, all of this would require workers that would have to come from other industries. You know, in my state, there's an example of a green lobby group that has a great plan for 240,000 jobs in the low emissions economy, which is fantastic. But it's a sixth of the state's workforce, and to get those workers installing those solar panels or doing whatever else, you have to take them from other parts of society. So these things always involve trade-offs. It's not as simple as just as people saying, "Oh, gee, we need to cut carbon emissions." And I'm not accusing you of saying that, right? But it's very complicated to make the transition in a way where we don't severely damage people's living standards. But I think within 10 or 20 years' time, as coal-fired power stations get old, right, we'll replace them, and you know, we'll start to reforest and things like that. And there's much to be optimistic about. I think you go for it. I'm also looking forward, just one thing, I'm looking forward to some slam poetry from you at some point, Yoram, because I understand you're a very experienced.
I can give you one.
Yoram, before you go, I just have a quick question for Matt, because I think it'll give us some clarity. What incentive today do businesses have to become carbon neutral? Because you said many of them have become carbon neutral. Is there some economic incentive, or are they just doing it from the goodness of their heart?
Sure. I should say lots of them are promising to be carbon neutral. Well, some are, but lots of them, the big oil and gas companies are promising to be carbon neutral in 30 years. I think there's a couple of reasons. Number one is there's an increasing number of people in society that don't want to buy power or whatever else from an organization that's polluting the planet, and fair enough. And again, that's human beings making their own decisions, making their own choices off their own beliefs. It doesn't require any sort of central coordination. And maybe you and I would both agree that that's a good thing. The other point is technology is improving in a really impressive way. So we're getting to a point now where you can have, I really love energy economics, so sorry to drone off, but we're getting to the point now where if you live in a remote community, it's cheaper for us to build solar panels and a battery and have it managed like that rather than a massive power cable going out into the town. And that's happening a bit in the developed world, and over time it's also, there's companies that want to take this technology into the developing world. So it's cheaper if you're in a village in India or wherever, think of a random country without power, it's cheaper to put solar panels there and a battery than it is to to have a
100%.
coal power station and run a huge electricity cable all the way out there. So there's a bit of both social license and economic incentive.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
No, I totally agree with that. Like I think possibly where we are agreeing is that one way or another, technology is going to be a huge part of the answer to all of these problems. You know, like moving for, and I certainly don't think you should shut down all the current industrial technologies and immediately replace them with new tech in such a violent transition where people are thrown out of work. And you know, certainly not advocating that. But I do want to talk about one thing where you said if you put these people out of business, etc., you cut off their livelihood. So it's this issue of livelihood and the fact that under our system, the only way to get livelihood is to trade your labor for cash, and that being a citizen doesn't give you really any economic rights whatsoever. You've got the right to work, and you've got you know, free speech and the right to vote, but you don't have land by definition as a citizen. You can be a homeless citizen. That's fair under our current laws. You can be a citizen and starve to death. That's totally fair under our current laws, right? If you haven't made money to get food, that's your problem. And so if people had, and someone in the comments raised this, one of my friends, Charles, raised this, that UBI or some form of universal income is some sort of bridging between a form of socialism, a form of free market, that if people had, you know, a piece of land guaranteed and a piece of the economy guaranteed to them, then these transitions wouldn't be as brutal. Because any transition now that cuts off your job, and we're seeing this in COVID, you're cut out of your job, you got nothing. And the government has to come in quickly to start supplying cash to people so that they simply don't starve to death. And what are people paying, you know, at least a third of their income on is just literally somewhere to live, whether that's via rent or via a mortgage. Just to have somewhere to live takes you a massive chunk of your working life just to get. And again, I don't know how this fits into economic theory at all, but from my point of view, land's been here for 4 billion years. You know, no company invented the land. And the fact that effectively all land is controlled via the banks through their lending, and the amounts that you need to buy land is on a normal salary, you know, decades of work. To me, this just is a senseless system. And now maybe you've got a really beautiful answer for why that's not senseless, but yeah, to me, like, given that we've got, and again, this is a Marxist point. Marx makes the point that technology is so advanced, and he was saying this in 1840. He was already saying technology is so advanced that we can feed, clothe, and house everybody quite easily. You know, that's how powerful our tech is right now. And if he was saying that in 1840s, I can only imagine in the 2020s, the technological ability to clothe and feed people is like pretty simplistic, and same with housing people. So, you know, in the current capitalist system, sure, it's good at all of the points that you've raised, but there's ways that it can be much, much better for ordinary people who aren't capitalists, i.e. aren't part of that 0. whatever percent who are controlling capital flows, to just have what technology can provide very, very simply and easily, and what up until recently was part of the social contract. Like most societies for most of history, and I mean history stretching back 80, 90,000 years, having rights to land was fundamental to what you were. It's really only in the industrial system that hasn't been the case. You know, there were people in this country who were living for, you know, the better part of 80,000 years in systems where land and ecology and food supply was part of the deal of being part of a nation. And that has been sort of taken out of our social contract, and we just accept that as oh, that's the way it is. The only way you can get anything is if you work a job, even though that doesn't need to be. You know, we can provide food and housing. You know, it's a fraction of the industrial output. I'm
But
done.
Yeah, Matt.
let me hit all those points if I can remember them all. I tried to jot them down.
Sure.
So firstly, about people without housing, for example, we spend $180 billion a year in Australia on social security and welfare. So we allocate our income, it gets reallocated to social security and welfare. I reckon it gets allocated pretty badly, though, because there's lots of people who get it that don't need it, and lots of people that need it that don't get it. And again, some might say that that's a flaw with having all these things so centrally managed. There's definitely a benefit to. I appreciate the argument behind universal basic income. Even then, though, right? If you're a coal, if you're working in a mine or something, or working as an engineer in a gas plant, you're going from 150K a year. I mean, no universal basic income is ever going to cover that, right? And nor should it. So people will be seeing lower living standards if they're transitioned, as will others in society. If you transition too rapidly, because when you spoke about COVID, you actually hit on to something which is really important. At the moment, people can't go to work for good reason. We're trying to keep everybody safe from the virus. But that also means that we can't make stuff. Whether you think of and whether that stuff be, doing haircuts, or whether that stuff be selling food or whatever else. I think is my screen frozen? It looks like I have.
It's a little choppy, but the audio is coming in clear.
Whatever that stuff may be, if you have less people working making stuff. Okay, I'll try to stop swinging my head. If you have people, if you cut the number of people that are making stuff, the amount of stuff you're going to make in a year is going to be reduced, right? And so that's fundamentally the problem. Is that if you just on the climate thing with the transition, is if you turn off a lot of the resources in society and say we're not going to use them, then we don't get the economic benefit out of them. If you tell people they can't go into work, you don't get the economic benefit out of them, whatever the circumstance might be. Now, there's some merit to a universal basic income, but again, you've got to ask yourself the question: when our country spends, more than 10% of our total income in a year on welfare and social services, how is this problem not fixed? And it's interesting. I did a feature earlier this year. I spoke to some homeless people in the city, which I found really rewarding. But one of the things that really sanded me actually is the first guy I spoke to. He had a house for he bought a house for his wife, he said, but he left because they fought all the time and he started taking drugs, and now he's on the streets and he's staying at a mate's place. The second guy was living in state housing, publicly owned housing in South Australia, but he left because he didn't like it. Which made me think that it's not necessarily about how much money you spend. Sometimes it needs to be about empathy and a relationship and building a community around someone, and that can often be done best by society as opposed to by the government. And on your big point about land supply, as to whether anybody has a right to own land, I don't know about feudal England or whatever. I don't think a lot of people owned land in the feudal times. In fact, I think for most of history, I would say that, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, that in a lot of places in the world, people didn't have a right to own land. But what you've got to think about is, you have a house, someone has to build it. If you have a house, you need bricks from somewhere. If you have a house, you need carpet, you need the wood, you need all these things, right? Someone has to be paid to provide all of those
housing
things.
construction is a fraction of the cost of
as a society, I think that's a good point. That the cost of land is very high, particularly in Australia. But again, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but we live in a country where a huge portion of the country is undeveloped, where we've got the government, which at the time gradually releases little bits of land here and little bits of land there around the city. So the land, that's probably so expensive. The other reason why land is very expensive is that quite often all of the economic benefit from something will go to the landowner. If you go to like a cafe in the city, the prices will be higher because they're paying much higher rent. So the benefit of so the reason land ownership is so expensive is because quite often a lot of economic returns flow directly to the person that owns land. Now, is that an issue? Well, arguably, if there's something that we need to be taxing, maybe we should be taxing land rather than taxing people earning an income or people making a business and doing exciting things. Better to tax land, I think, and tax maybe, this will be controversial for the conservatives, but I would rather we lived in a society where we taxed land, where we taxed carbon pollution, and where we taxed people who inherit massive sums of money, than live in a society where we tax people for going out and getting a job, earning an income, or developing an interesting new product and making a profit. So,
I agree 150% with you.
There we go. We've found commonality.
You make a really important point, and that's kind of maybe one of the points I've been trying to make, is that the innovation and work of people is clearly valuable. It's the flat out owning of capital, and what you've identified is like land and inheritance, that there's no logic to why someone should necessarily own and reap benefit from these things, except from the actual original owners who truly own it, and not the descendants of the people that stole it. But even leaving that to one side, and that is a problem in Australia, is that we're sorry, this is for the Aussies. We're a country that's making its money off land and financial services and not off innovation, because there's very little incentive to be in innovation and a lot of incentive to be in land and financial services. And the net benefit to the human race is to be in innovation, because the land's going to be here. Like, no one did anything for the land. It'll be here under socialism, capitalism, or any ideology into the future. The land's going to be here. It's the innovation that's going to enable the human race to do better things, to transition from industrial techs to new techs and all the rest of it. So on that point, I'm with you. Like innovation needs to be incentivized more, and lazy things like literally collecting incomes off rent from land, and collecting gigantic inheritances, it doesn't help anybody except those very few people that collect those rent and those inheritances. So I'm with you there.
Let me take a quick intermission here. I just want to point out that we've had multiple beautiful agreements, and that's what makes this debate great, because it's not, when in a debate do you see sides agreeing and trying to build off one another? That's not the reality of debates today, and that's why we do what we do here. It's in order to change the current paradigm of debate and dialogue, and to make it be productive. It's not about defeating one another, it's about building and learning from one another. With that said, if you haven't already, smash that like button, unless you don't like it, and then downvote this shit too, because that's what we're about.
No, freedom of expression. The like button.
And upvote, downvote, I really don't care. Just be active. And if you like what our guests are, and subscribe. We're doing this every Thursday. We have other cool content going on. And if you like our guests, their contact information is in the description. So feel free to follow them and reach out to them to continue this dialogue after the fact. I want to, Matt, this is a question for you, because you did make a good point that government is inefficient, right? So they spend all this money on poverty, and we still have poverty. So would you say this? Do you think there's a private sector solution to that, or does government just need to be better at distributing funds to the weakest members in society?
Great question.
And maybe there might be no answer.
Okay. I believe, and you know what? I couldn't stand here and say that we shouldn't have welfare, because I probably wouldn't be alive if we didn't have a welfare system. So from when I was growing up, from when I was younger. So I absolutely acknowledge that it's important. It's a real challenge, though, in a country where, and democracy is great, right? But it's a challenge to allocate money to the people who need it most when the system isn't really designed very well to do that. But universal basic income it's done in a particular way, and we might disagree on how exactly it should be done. I'm a big lover of the negative income tax, which was a Milton Friedman idea. So there's lots of capitalists, lots of big capitalist supporters that really like the idea of a universal basic income, but it has to be done in a way where you don't disincentivize people from working. Because remember, I mean, there's a lot of talk about, we're being very negative to work tonight, but having a job and having work is one way, not the only way, but it is a way to feel part of a community, to feel like you're contributing to society. and it also is a way of actually contributing to society. And we want people either in jobs or volunteering or doing something where they are contributing as much as possible, and so make sure we have a system that incentivizes that. And one of the problems, I think, in a lot of places, I think of France as an example, where welfare is extremely generous, is they disincentivize people going to work. And perhaps even, I speak to some business owners here, and this is a very sensitive issue, of course, but I speak to business owners here, and they can't get staff because we've increased the unemployment benefit very, very substantially. Now, there's a good reason we did that in Australia because of COVID, and we want to make sure that people have a certain living standard, but it does have a downside impact, which is that they're disincentivized from working. So you need a system where you can protect people, the most vulnerable people, while also
incentivized
not discouraging them from working. And
one
more thing, mental health. Mental health is a big one, and that was certainly the experience when I spoke to homeless people. Is I think, and from other circumstances that I've seen in my life, and it's kind of the sad thing is there's not necessarily any amount of money that can fix a mental health issue, necessarily, or any amount of government intervention. And it might, that requires, it's not my area of expertise, but heavens, we need to do something more to improve that.
So that I can totally agree with as well.
I want to build off one point that you mentioned, that welfare disincentivizes people from working. That's actually why universal basic income may be an elegant solution, because you will get it regardless of if you work or not. And it's true that tying getting money to not working is not a good way to incentivize people to working. That being said, and this is for both of you, do you think we need to start preparing for a world where there actually won't be work for everybody because automation will take up, I don't even want to say most of the jobs, but so many jobs that you have large percentages of the population that are not working? And I want to bring up a point that the socialist argument might need to be reformed, that workers deserve to own the means of production. What about the non-workers? What do they own, right? So we might need a different slogan to frame that argument. That just the fact that you're a citizen and born into a world where your ancestors built all this technology before you, just based off that, you deserve to have a basic standard of living. And this kind of ties into mental health as well, because it seems like one of the best things for someone's mental health is to live a life filled with meaning. Work has the ability to provide meaning, but as we see, it's probably not enough. But if we don't work, do we need something else to give us meaning in life? So there's kind of a few points there. Feel free to build on those.
Yeah. So socialism as an ideology and capitalism as whether it's an ideology or just a fact of the world, they both come out of a previous era. They were both attempting to solve problems that presented themselves in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. They both predate computers. They predate automation for sure, and they also predate ecological consciousness. So the socialism that Marx developed and that was developed by others predates ecological consciousness by over 100 years. So this is kind of why I don't like calling myself a socialist, because to me, we're in a whole new world now that's vastly more complex and complicated than it was in the 19th century and even in the 20th century. And I mean, even like your point about automation. So there's no question automation is going to annihilate a lot of jobs. How many? No one knows yet. Some people think, whatever automation takes away, some new thing will come up, so there'll always be room for human beings. And on the other side is, no, the robots will do absolutely everything. And I mean, time will prove.
I believe the latter. There's going to be very little.
I also believe that, but we have to wait and see what will be to see how it actually will manifest. And so, the idea that the workers should control is sort of, you're right, not quite the point. It's that human beings should have rights, whether they're workers or non-workers or anything in between. It's just that when the ideology of socialism was developed, there was a pretty clear distinction that there were people that were workers and people that were capital owners, and the system didn't work without workers back then. There were no robots, there was no automation, there was none of that was even a concept, let alone a reality. The other point I want to just briefly address is this idea of mental health. So to me, mental health is the number one issue in Australia and probably the number one issue in the world. The figures are something like 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 people will suffer mental health issues at some point in their life. My gut feeling is it's 100% of people will suffer for quite a lot of their lives. And I don't believe either socialism or capitalism is an answer to that. Because again, both of them are ways to run industrial economies. And I think the very fact of having to go to work every day, living in concrete jungles, worrying about how you're going to pay for things, being in societies that atomize you and break down social structures, and not seeing enough sunshine and trees, like literally, I don't mean that glibly, you're never going to have mental health. Like it's always going to be an uphill battle, and you'll need to, use medications or coping mechanisms, and it will always be coping. It won't actually be true, mental thriving. So I don't feel that either, like the point of an economic system is to try and deliver material goods in as Matt sort of laid down at the very beginning. We can agree that the best system is the one that can deliver the best amount of things. So I can't remember exactly how you framed it, but sure, in terms of material things, you need some sort of economic system to try and distribute that out. But in terms of getting our mental health, these structures are nightmarish. And we've lost Adar. Okay. But again, coming back to my friend Marx, like he has a whole section in the Communist Manifesto where he basically describes that living under the industrial capitalist system is living a life of anxiety. It is non-stop, total anxiety from the minute you get up in the morning till the minute you go to bed, and your dreams are going to be filled with anxiety as well. And so the human being is at odds with our current system. And whether capital is controlled by government or private companies, I think it's irrelevant to how to deal with those mental health issues. And so, yeah, I don't have an answer for you, but I think it's way transcendent of these two ideologies that emerged in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries to deal with where we're at today in 2020.
So, Matt, before I give you the mic, just to strengthen what you said, your industrialized nations have more mental health issues than developing nations. We don't know all the reasons, but it may be the reasons that you just explained. So
yeah, we don't know all the reasons, but and I don't know if there's like how much hard research there is on this, but there's certainly like bucket loads of anecdotal research that the more the stronger community bonds are, generally the better the mental health. And in mass societies of millions of people living who are communicating with each other really via the media, these social structures are virtually non-existent. And so trying to build, happiness or mental health within that context is kind of impossible, I think.
Matt, all you.
I'm not sure about. Yeah, go for it. Thanks, Matt. I'm not sure about the numbers on industrial nations versus developing nations, and it might be something to do with the fact that we have a much better mental health system here to identify problems. I don't know, but certainly, yeah, I have heard of some anecdotal examples too of people being very happy. One of the things, though, is I think one of the benefits of having an industrialized economy is that people have much more access to information than they ever have before. The human race is destined to do some amazing things. We've got an entire universe out there to explore. And I think, I'm not being glib, right? But I think a system where we develop and we have technological progress, obviously I think it's capitalism, you disagree, but a system that can deliver that can take us to some really amazing places. In terms of the mental health issue more specifically, yeah, I understand what you're saying about people living in cities. I'm very personally, I'm very fortunate. I live in Perth, and if anyone's watching, you should come visit Perth when you can. Compared to a lot of other cities which are very densely packed. But I don't know if that's a capitalism thing or a socialism thing, because there's lots of people that live in Moscow, for example.
Those ideologies.
It could be sure. But I don't think it. But I think it's something that can be fixed. It's something that can be fixed within the capitalist system. But it's about people making a choice at what sort of life they want to live. One thing that is very important, I think, to mental health is people having the freedom to run their own race and make their own decisions on how they want their life to go. And I reckon hundreds of years ago, people were pretty anxious too, even though probably no one knew what anxiety was back many hundreds of years ago. But I think there was still, if you were living in a time where, there's a plague and you don't know how to deal with it or whatever else, people would have been, very anxious. Which is probably why there are a lot of other things in society that they had other systems to keep people under. I suppose back then they tried to focus on keeping people under control. I need to go back a step to automation to answer your question. I think there's a lot of good potential from automation. From an economic standpoint, I think it's a fantastic thing, because you've got to remember that we work in jobs to contribute to society, but we also do it because our contribution gets us something back, which is income, which is only fair. But the more that you can have a system where things can be made cheaply and inexpensively, the better off we are. So if you can make a house using a robot, and there's some examples of people working on this, for much more cheaply, then it improves the ability of people to get housing or whatever else. Or if you can transport food using an automated vehicle, it's much more cheap and much more accessible. The real question I have is, so it's not so much an economic problem. I think living standards will improve dramatically from having automation, and we might all be living in a society where even if we don't work, where we can still get wonderful things at the push of a button. The question about meaning is the real question there. I don't know how society would, I don't know how people would find meaning. I'm sure they'd find a way, right? But it's not immediately obvious to me, if you're not going out and working in a team doing things, how you'd find meaning in life. I think there was the mention earlier of Karl Marx. Ultimately, I reckon it'd be pretty, and with the world, in fact, we have a world where healthcare is accessible to, in a very high quality and accessible to so many people, and it's improving. We have a world where people's working conditions have improved a lot. We have a world where people can access housing and food and clothes and whatever else, where you can talk to someone I can talk to someone in Israel off a little device I hold in my hand, and I can search for almost all of the knowledge ever researched in human history on the internet. It's a wonderful thing, and I think the world's turned out in a very positive way, and will continue to do so.
Yeah.
Am I still here?
I'm with you.
Or have I disappeared?
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
So I would
see
say,
your faces.
Oh, you can't see us? Well, we see you and we hear you. So that's what's important. Speaking on what's important, Yoram, the way you broke it down, I've actually never heard it. It's a whole new paradigm, right? We're stuck talking about capitalism versus socialism, what the role of the private sector versus the public sector is. But really, it's like that's just one category of society. That's an industrial society. I've been having similar thoughts, just I framed it a little bit differently. It seems like we have misaligned incentives, and socialism doesn't solve this, right? So it's similar to what you're saying. A company, their goal is profit. It's right. That's what the shareholders care about. It's profit. It's somewhat aligned with customers, because they want customers to like their product. So if customers don't like the product, they won't they won't make profit. But wanting a product or thinking you need a product is not the same as being a happy individual. So humans want to be happy, companies want to make profit. And even if we were to let workers own the means of production, they will still have a goal to achieve profit, not human well-being. So essentially, you have companies and institutions working at increasing their profit, they do not take human well-being into consideration. This is not solved, not in a capitalist system, not in a socialist system. So again, I think we're back to the same point. But how do we align the incentives of companies with the well-being of humanity? I think this is the $1 million question that we need to ask ourselves. Do you guys have any ideas to how to approach that?
Well, I really disagree with the assertion that companies aren't. Sure, mate. Thank you. I really disagree with the assertion that companies aren't aligned with the well-being of humanity. And remember that companies are made up of people, right? And most people, you even speak to people who work in the energy industry or the oil and gas industry, and they'll say, yeah, we know we need to reduce emissions, and we want to be involved in that. People who work in industries that it's popular to hate, the resources industry or the mining industry, but they're incredibly passionate. Even rich people who are incredibly passionate about Aboriginal empowerment, for example. So, I disagree with this assertion. Basically, the assertion that people who run companies don't care about the well-being of people. I disagree with this assertion that
I fully support that
companies
assertion.
aren't aligned with. Well, I'm sure we'll get to that in a sec. But companies. When you say companies aren't aligned with trying to do things for people, why would I want to buy something from someone unless they make something that is useful to me in some way? I don't get into this, and I think that that probably makes sense to people. What you're saying is, well, there's advertising, and sort of advertising sometimes make people buy stuff maybe they don't want. Well, maybe, but I reckon human beings are smarter than that, than to see huge amounts of advertising. I don't buy a lot of stuff. I got this at Target, very, very cheap. I don't buy a lot of stuff. And I reckon most people out there, I think it's fallacious to say that everybody just, because of marketing or whatever, wants to go out and buy lots of stuff. I think generally, if a company wants to make money, it needs to either A, do something that people want, make something people want to buy, or B, it needs to do something that the government wants to pay them for, which is an issue that we can maybe get into.
So let me just give a little pushback here. So, well, you said people won't buy what they don't want, but our wants are defined by our environment. And when you're seeing commercials, billboards, advertisements from the time you're a little kid, just saying we're smart enough to know, well, it's not really an issue of intelligence. It's just an issue of our values being defined from a very young age to view the world in a very specific way. And all too many people, and again, I'm not speaking for anybody here right now, but all too many people get their value from the amount of material wealth that they have. So their value is not how, and again, it's not a blanket statement of all humanity. I'm just saying we have an excess of this value, that my value is how nice my clothes are, how big my house is, the car I drive, and then flaunting that on social media so people could see what I'm worth, not how many people I help, what I'm contributing to society. So, and even if 50% of the population don't fall for this, to have half the population be, and I'm under the impression it's more than half, to be kind of controlled in a sense, to have their values dictated by private companies that want profit, that to me seems like a huge issue. And another area where it's clear that companies are going to value profit over well-being. Let's take a classic example. Pharmaceuticals. Do you think that the shareholders of a pharmaceutical company would be happy if the CEO comes in and said, we found a pill that cures diabetes? They would probably prefer something that helps with diabetes and blood pressure. It's not a one-time fixed cure. So you have misaligned incentives because they would rather sell you a product every day than once. I mean, that's just economics. If I was a shareholder, I would expect that from my CEO to sell products daily, not to cure the actual problem. Another example is what we put in foods. If we could substitute something organic or healthy in food,
that's just nonsense, to be honest. Just seriously.
So let me just finish the food example, and then you go, and then Yoram, you could build off it. If a company can substitute, if a company could substitute something in food, take out something healthy and put in something artificial that probably long-term wouldn't be good for your health, but it will cut down the price, or maybe even it has some addictive qualities. As we know, McDonald's and other fast food chains do put some addictive things in their foods. they will do that, right? There's nothing stopping them from getting you hooked on their food and making that food for as low a cost as possible. And the only thing they need is approval from the FDA, that's America's Food and Drug Administration. I'm sure every country has their own, which in itself is corrupted by big money. So, it seems like there is a clear misalignment of incentives.
Well, I want to hear why
Matt thinks the FDA, government institution.
Well, I'm not.
Sure.
I'm not.
Okay.
I haven't made big support for government today.
People. No, I get you. People here, people who are shareholders in these companies are people like us. Do you know? Lots of people in Australia have superannuation funds, and about $2.7 trillion of money is invested in superannuation. In America, it's called the 401k. Lots of people sort of save for their retirement or whatever else, and through that, it gets channeled into a lot of investments. So, and this is a real miracle, actually, when you think about it, of capitalism, is that workers own the means of production, not directly, right? Not always directly, but they can own the means of production. They can own really big corporations through the stock market or whatever else. They can diversify their risk, and it's a fantastic thing. So if I were a shareholder in a pharmaceutical company, and you're saying that the person came out and said, oh, we've got a cure for diabetes, I would say, great. And quite often you see when companies come up with cures for things or whatever else, the share price goes up. You also see people invest in lots of biotech businesses out there that want to cure things, or they want to, there's an example of Jeff Bezos's investments where he's put money into things that want to heal people with neurodegenerative disorders or whatever else. There's lots of companies out there that want to cure things, and people are happy to invest into them. So I disagree with this assertion that me as someone, or you as someone that might own shares in a company, would be really disappointed if our company fixed diabetes or cured cancer. And also, I mean, if you really be purely economic about it, curing an illness could make a company a lot of money, because suddenly they won't be buying products from everybody else. People will be buying products from the company that cures the illness. So it's a win for a company if they can fix a problem like that. And then finally, I mean, there was this assertion earlier that the government funds research. So, we still have, at least in society at the moment, we still have that happening in the background to potentially find cures to things as a backstop too.
So, cool. Can I take that on?
Yeah, all you. I do have one area, but you can go first. Yeah.
So, on this, I'm way more inclined to agree with Adar. I think he's hit the nail on the head, and I want to talk about two things. So one is this idea that capitalism is fulfilling needs versus the idea that advertising is manufacturing synthetic needs. So Noam Chomsky points this out pretty beautifully in a lot of his work, but specifically in Manufacturing Consent, where he says that in the early 20th century, and again, it's sort of a similar point to what Marx makes, is that the industrial system was, even at that point, good enough to pretty much supply everything that anybody needed. And they were like, so what do we do now? How do we keep growing? Where does the next, frontier of profit come from? And so he documents the emergence of this thing he calls the public relations industry, that we call the advertising industry, that begun by a nephew of Freud's called Edward Bernays, but now really a highly, highly developed industry that uses all the tools of modern psychology to invent desires and implant them in people in almost a constructed insanity. That if you got down to like really what is a human being, what does a real human being need, and it comes down to things like community, sunshine, water, versus brands and brand loyalty and all the myriad ridiculous things that industrial society produces, pool toys and 100 million different styles of jeans and t-shirts and whatnot.
It's fun.
It is a psychological warfare on human beings and on the human psyche conducted via the media that is the source of a lot of this. So, and I think, in the one hand, sure, humans are smart, but when you're living inside, for lack of a better term, the media matrix, the matrix defines your entire reality, and you can't really have thoughts and desires that are separated out from that matrix. And when that matrix, and again, this is where sort of categories like government versus private industry are, to me, a bit missing the point, is what you really have is centers of power. And all of those centers of power are motivated for power. And in the private world, we call that power, motivation, profit. And in the government sphere, you might call it something else. But both government and private industry are just giant power sources or power centers. And they are motivated via power and maintaining power or extending power. And even though you gave examples of many individuals in companies who are good, that doesn't mean the system is good, or that the system isn't driving them towards certain outcomes. And I think that Adar's totally right. Something like the health industry is not motivated to find a cure for cancer. It's motivated to find management for cancer. It's not motivated to find a cure for diabetes. It's motivated to provide management for diabetes, and so on and so forth. And so, like, when you get to something like food, so in Australia, we've got far more robust health systems than what's happened in the USA. But in the USA, over the last 60 years, food companies have literally bribed the government to allow them to sell what is essentially poison. And the quality of some of the things that are being sold over there, the kind of chemicals that are being used, the levels of sugar that are being pumped into the food, and again, the amount of research being done to make food addictive for the purposes of it being addictive, and all of that leads back to what is the fundamental purpose of any company, is to make profit. And it is not to make people healthy, it is to make profit. It is not to provide food, it is to make profit. Providing food, providing health are only means towards the only end that any company has, which is the creation of profit. And when you're in that system, you're motivated by that system, and motivated that you have to turn out quarterly, annual, whatever profits, you are not motivated for what is good for the human being. And I feel that that's an irreconcilable problem at the heart of profit incentivized enterprise. And that could be government as well, because again, we're really just talking about power, and profit is only one sort of manifestation of power. And governments, to me, are equally guilty in the misuse, abuse, and whatever you want to say around power and control. And to me, government, as it actually manifests in the actual world, government and big industry are allies of each other, if not two sides of a similar coin, two gigantic styles of organization that control large chunks of everything, and neither of them have humanity as their interest. Their fundamental interest is power, and power comes by controlling humans, whether it's controlling them outright the way governments do, or whether it's controlling them through their spending the way companies do. The way these institutions work is by being powerful and by extending and maintaining power. So that to me, that is why, to me, this system is anti-human in many ways. And that's notwithstanding all the gains that technology and industry has provided, that you've so eloquently pointed out, knowledge and certain types of living standards, certainly material living standards for many people. Nevertheless, there is a massive tension between the inherent goals of power systems and the true desires or health of actual human beings. Did that make sense?
Let me hit all those points if I can, because there's a lot of them there. But firstly, let's get rid of this idea that companies are only motivated by quarterly profits. I think on any given year, about 70% of the companies on the ASX lose money. And investors know that, particularly when they invest in really small companies. They know they're going to lose money for a long time. Biotech companies, could be a 10 or 15 year payoff for some of those things. When people like Jeff Bezos found a company, or Mark Zuckerberg or whomever else, or me or you or anybody, you do it in the knowledge that you may not make money for 5 years or 10 years. So there's lots of people out there that are developing products and investing in things, and they're playing the long game. So number one, this short-term profit motivation thing is not quite right. The second point, are industry and government allies? Well, yeah, they are. And that is a problem. But that is one of the reasons why we should limit the power of government. And I'm a big believer in that, because industries can rent seek from government, and it gets bad results for everybody. And it's not necessarily a corrupt thing. It's not necessarily it's not always a corrupt thing. It can just be something as simple as, in Australia, we have regulations about how many pharmacies can be in a certain radius or whatever garbage, because politicians are scared that if they try to change the law, that the pharmacists will put massive posters up saying this politician's horrible. In my state, we had a board which used to regulate production of potatoes because politicians were scared that if they changed it, they would lose a lot of votes in a particular marginal electorate. So it's just crazy. But I think the reason I love free markets and capitalism is that if you limit the scope of government, you can limit the scope for those problems. About people being motivated by power. Well, people are motivated by power. A lot of people are. And, I know some people who have gone into politics who are, if I can use the term, they're pretty bad hombres, to be honest with you, on all sides, many different parties. I know some bad hombres. Again, this is one of the reasons why I think free markets are good, because to be successful in a free market, you have to do something. You have to provide a product that people want to buy. Whereas to be successful in Parliament, you just need to promise people you're going to give them something. And whether you actually do or not, unfortunately, all too often, it doesn't actually happen. So if people are motivated by power, let's have a system where we harness people's motivations to make sure that they provide things for others. And just on to this point about advertising, how amazing, what a miracle that we can live in a society where we're capable of producing enough stuff that we have to convince people. Supposedly, this is your assertion, I'm not saying I agree with it, but we have to convince people to buy more stuff because because we've done such a fantastic thing of being able to provide the basics for so many people. And we know that there are some people that fall through the cracks, and that's not necessarily a function of capitalism, it's a function of a lot of other things, right? And it's something that we need to address. But isn't it an amazing thing now that we have people in society who aren't worried about every day where their next meal is going to come from? Who don't have to spend 2 hours a day trying to wash their clothing or whatever else because they've got a washing machine. I think it's wonderful that we can even have this debate about whether marketing is kind of convincing some people to buy some extra shirts or whatever else, or whether they buy a much more expensive car. And yeah, you know what? I agree with you that there are some people out there that buy garbage, and I don't understand why. I don't know why anyone would want an expensive car. It doesn't do it for me. I think people should be motivated by contributing and making an impact in society, and increasingly, people of our generation they're starting startups and social enterprises and trying to do things about the climate, and they're motivated by making a difference. Maybe the boomers were all self-motivated just by material things, but that's changing. And I guess to bring all of that back to the root of the debate, there's more happiness, there's more opportunity, and there's better living standards generated by having free markets and having the most distributed mechanism and competitive mechanism of power and production possible. Good. And if you have systems where it's all in a feudal lord or centralized in a government or whatever else, allocating capital and everything else, we've seen disasters. There's a good ramble. Hopefully that answers all your points. Not sure if I would have convinced you though.
No, you haven't.
Well,
what can I convince you on? What more can I say? What would you like me to convince you on?
So, a few things, and I try to stay as just the moderator, but I kind of get pulled into it. So it's true what you said, that companies sometimes give up on short-term profit, but that's not for the well-being of humanity. It's for long-term profit. So I don't think that matters if the profit is short-term or long-term. Their goal is profit. And even if we could point to a few instances in which profit and well-being are aligned, that doesn't mean they're inherently aligned they don't diverge at any given point. And I think that if we want to build a beautiful society, we need to look at the places where they diverge and see how we can align those incentives. I think that's just, a necessary aspect to building a healthy society.
Can we name some places where they diverge?
Yeah, well, so I'll go back to the pharmaceuticals in a minute. I just want a last point about, I agree with you that it's awesome that we can have too much to buy, in a sense, right? We're not starving to death. But it seems because of how this current model exists and is played out, we have an abundance of material wealth, and we begin to have scarcity of mental well-being, right? So there's a trade-off. So again, it's not, we could say that it's beautiful that we can have all this stuff to advertise, but if people are committing suicide at higher rates than ever before, if people are dying from drug overdose at higher rates than ever before, and again, I can't speak for the whole world, but I know in America and in general, first world countries, suicide rates increase. America has more people dying from drug overdoses than ever before. So again, abundance of material wealth is only one aspect of it that we should look at. We should measure a society's value by their well-being, by how happy they are, by how little drug addiction they have, by how little violence they have, by how little depression they have. So again, I'm not saying that free markets can't contribute to these goals, but I don't think that free markets and growth should be the goal. It should help us achieve the goal, which is human well-being. And I just want to make a point on pharmaceuticals, because you said that there is benefit to creating a cure. So I may be incorrect in my assumption here, but there seems to be more money to be made if you need to take a drug every single day. And it seems like if you look at almost all conditions that I can think of, it seems like the prescription that you're going to get is one you need to take for your whole life. I can't think of many that you just take one pill and cure it. I may be wrong, but this could also be my lack of understanding in health issues. Maybe it's very hard to create a one-use pill that cures you, right? I'm open to me being wrong there. But let's look at it a different way. A pharmaceutical company's goal is to, let's even say it's to cure you. Our goal as a society is to stop us from getting sick in the first place. It's preventative medicine. It's to live a healthy lifestyle so we won't have diabetes and high blood pressure and be overweight. Whose job is it to give us those values as a society? Whose job is it to tell us, you know what, you're overweight, you don't need blood pressure medicine, you need to start eating healthy, and you need to start exercising, right? Obviously, pharmaceuticals aren't going to do that. They want to sell you drugs, regardless if it's a pill every day or if it's a one-time pill. They want you to buy the pill. They don't want you to be healthy enough where you won't need a pill in the first place. So again, and what you've made excellent points at why the public sector doesn't do a good job. I tend to agree. I think we may need to automate as many aspects of the public sector as possible, find better balances of power. I'm definitely open to that, but I don't see as markets and growth being the main or only thing we should value. There's too many flaws and it does not take into consideration human well-being. So that's kind of my last good.
I absolutely agree with you that human well-being is the most important thing at the end of it all. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is that markets are contributing a huge amount to that. And we think about the example, we talk about China, we talked about the 1 billion people that have been lifted out of extreme poverty in the past few decades. It's a miracle. It's an incredible thing, and it's a human achievement that we should be very proud of, that the number of people in extreme poverty is falling. And maybe not this year because it's been a very difficult year, but it's falling more generally. My phone's just done something strange. So am I still present, or am I
We
lost?
can hear you. Your image is frozen.
Okay.
We still hear
hopefully
you.
It's going to work okay. Okay. So human well-being should be important, and we're talking about this in a very developed society where we're very lucky. But thinking about all those countries in the world where people are being lifted out of poverty, where they're getting huge new opportunities to do things with their life that they've never had before. I think all of that's positive. There are other things that are important too. Culture, religion. I think, to be honest with you, I think society being less religious, and perhaps, when I was younger, I was pretty much a let's do everything sort of a guy, let's do whatever. But, as I grow up, I think, sometimes I wonder if the fact that our values have sort of changed as a society has a lot to do with mental well-being, as opposed to marketing, for example. So a few things. Why don't we invent a pill to cure things? Well, if it was so easy to do, then all this government funding for medical research would do it. The assertion about whether or not a company wants to cure people, I can't fathom where this is coming from. That companies just don't want to cure people because they probably won't make any money out of it. That's just pure speculation, and I don't think the economics backs that up at all. I think if you're the company that develops a cure for cancer, if we're just talking about the money, you're going to make bank way more than any company that's doing treatments. In terms of preventative medicine, no one can do more, I think, for a person's health than themselves.
But where do they get values from? Again, saying but saying themselves, that's true. But what we know to be true is a result of the school we go to, what we see on TV. We're not born in a vacuum and we just figure things out. We're heavily influenced.
How often do you see advertising saying, "Don't be fat, go running, eat healthy food," or whatever else? You constantly see it. You see it even on Instagram. In fact, in Australia, you get it all the time. You constantly get barraged with advertising telling you that you should be healthy, that you shouldn't smoke cigarettes, that you shouldn't have alcohol. There are interest groups in civil society that are passionate about it, that invest in it. So I would say, I challenge that assertion. I don't think there's anybody out there in the developed world that thinks that being really fat is a good idea, or has been convinced by capitalism that they should never go for a run or anything like that. There are lots of reasons why people have unhealthy lifestyles, but I don't think it's because the values of society are all wrong and that society somehow values people being unhealthy. So there's a lot that we've covered over there. I think you're right that well-being should be absolutely key, and I think growth is an important part of that. It's not the only thing, but it is a very important part of it. And ultimately the incentive of a company to make money, it has to make a product that people want to buy, and you can't just advertise your way into getting people to buy all your stuff. Maybe you can a little bit here or there, but there will always be competitors that will try and make a better product. There will always be competitors that will try and do it more cheaply. There will always be people that come up with different ideas. So long as we have a system where there's competition and where there's the opportunity to do so, there will always be others that want to come along and do it. And that's why you see so many businesses fail. If advertising was so powerful, you wouldn't have massive department store chains going under as people go to online shopping, as an example. If advertising was so powerful, you'd never have one of these businesses, one of these retailers fail, or whatever else. So, advertising can influence people's decisions. I accept that, but I think you are really overemphasizing the significance that it has. And I'll pass it back over. Here's the baton. I'll pass it over to you again.
Sure. So the opposite. I think you're underestimating those effects. I'm not even sure where to begin on all of it. I want to.
You own a virtual reality business.
I just
How
want
do you
to put
make
out
a profit?
I want to put out one point about products. You need to make a product you want to buy. That's true, but heroin people also want to buy, right? So wanting to buy something is
and again that advertising. Wasn't from advertising.
In a sense, yeah, just not on TV, right? You have different means of advertising and getting people hooked. I would never want to see heroin commercials on TV, right? But that's a clear example of just because someone wants to buy something doesn't mean that they should be buying it, or it's therefore good for them, or them making the decision to buy it. Therefore, we should just accept it as is, right? We should strive to have a society where people don't want to buy heroin.
For sure, but it's not from advertising. I don't think it's not from evil companies. Sorry, go on, Yoram. I'm talking over you.
That's not entirely straightforward, but there's so much to think about. I do think you. I think that maybe me and Adar are more aligned on this. That you sort of view a human as a far more free agent or like what you might call a rational actor. And I don't want to put words in Adar's mouth, so I'll just talk about myself.
No, I'm with you on that. We're biological algorithms. We can be here.
I view the human far more as a function of the social fabric in which they are, and I don't want to dwell on it, but I think you're discounting, like, to sort of compartmentalize advertising into that word advertising is to kind of not appreciate the ubiquity and the power of the media structures that we're sort of ensconced within just by being, members of this current civilization, and that the things that we think are our own ideas are often implants from this advertising mesh that is, it's not just ads, it's TV, it's movies, it's the songs, it's the video clips, it's all of it is promoting a particular lifestyle. I can only talk from my own anecdotal experience on this sometimes, but I don't watch a lot of TV. And I don't participate in a lot of mass media, but every so often, I jump in to have a look at what's going on. And, the last time I watched reality TV, I'm like, no wonder people want clothes and makeup and all of this stuff. Like, this is what they're being pushed so heavily, and it's being shoved in their faces so much. And like most people watch telly, they go to the sports, they do the mass things. They like gambling is another one that's advertised relentlessly and is part of this nexus between private industry and government, where again it's beyond capitalism or public ownership. It's really about power centers and the way those power centers need to keep people under their control. But I want to talk about what you said, how wonderful it is that we've got this society that can produce all of these things. So we kind of need to invent new things. So the point that both Marx and I'm pretty sure Chomsky were trying to make is that if we really had a society that was producing all this stuff, people wouldn't have to go to work as much. People could, if you look at indigenous societies, caloric intake was very, very high, about 2,000 calories a day on average, and work was very low. The amount of actual work that was done was only a few hours a day. When you talk about how through most of history it was awful and terrible, what we're talking about is the history of the last 10,000 years or even the last 6,000 years. But human history is about 100,000 years old. So we're really only talking about between 5 to 10% of human history where it's been highly exploitative, and which modern capitalism or modern free markets are certainly less exploitative than your average feudal kingdom. No argument there. But in terms of what could be achieved, if we really have the tech that can enable the satisfaction of most of the basic needs, then we don't need to work as much. We don't need to live lives that are so anxiety-filled, because, even with all the tech and all the everything that we've got, what are most people doing, right? They're paying their bills. That whether they're earning $32,000 a year or $150,000 a year, they've got mortgages, they've got rents, they've got school fees, they've got, a list of expenses where most people are living, even people making $150K a year are living more or less dollar to dollar, paycheck to paycheck. And that to me is an irrational way to live, if it's true that our level of tech can actually provide so much that we don't need to be living in this way. So I'm back to it's the whole paradigm itself, and this idea that only through work and only through having a job that's economically meaningful can one find meaning in life. Now that's where we're at, because every signal that the media matrix is giving us, certainly in Australia, when I was over in the States, it was even more so, that the only way to have meaning in life, to be a valued member of society, etc., is to work economically. Now, I happen to have grown up in a culture that didn't believe that. So that's sort of my, like, you know, that's my privilege, that the culture I grew up in thought that there were much more important things to do than work. Now, the things that they thought were important, I don't necessarily think are that important per se. But it's very easy for me to conceive of meaning outside of having a job. In fact, it's harder for me to conceive of meaning in having a job. You know, like, to me, writing an opera is important. Writing poetry is important. Sometimes just sitting on the ground and looking at clouds is important. Most of the quote unquote real jobs I've had, what I was actually doing was making money for the business owners. And at some point in those jobs, I decided I got better things to do in my life than make Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so richer than they currently are. It's really not doing it for me. And so I guess this is sort of just a ramble without really a point, but to locate meaning in the job is, I think, like one of the key problems, or to not to locate it there, but to concentrate it there. And the other is that if we do have a technologically advanced society, people shouldn't be working 12 hours a day. And the reason they are is this is where it's not exactly free markets, because I think free markets have a lot going for them. It's the financial and credit systems and the way in which all of that's set up, that, yeah, you've got to basically work a third of your life just to have somewhere to live. You've got to work another third of your life to provide healthcare and education to your children, even though the system with its technology is very, very good at doing that, and it shouldn't need that much work on each individual's behalf to get those effects. And that, to me, is like the insanity of the current system that we're in.
Well, a few points.
It's all the points that you're making about how free markets can generate innovation. I kind of agree with you. I don't know if I 100% agree, but I more or less agree on a lot of it. It's the fact that it's also doing all this other negativity. And this is without even getting into the destruction of the ecosphere or the kind of things. No, it is the kind of things that Adar was mentioning, that healthcare companies are not fundamentally motivated to make people healthy. And food companies are motivated to get you addicted to their food. Gambling companies are motivated to get you addicted to gambling. Pornography companies are motivated to get you addicted to pornography, and so on and so forth. They're motivated to get you to repeat behaviors that make them profit. And then that's their motivation. That's their core DNA. And that is, like, at a fundamental, whatever the word is, that's across purposes to the true needs of a human being and the true needs of human society.
Yeah, Matt, before you answer, we're going to wrap it up soon. So audience, thank you for joining us. If anybody has questions, now's the time to ask them. Matt, all you.
Fire in the questions.
Cool.
Sorry, I spoke over you then. Awkward. I was trying to be funny. Are humans rational? Yeah, I get what you're saying. We're a product of the social fabric. That's entirely fair, and the media around us. But you know, what you are implying there is that you think, and I'm not trying to be rude here, right? But what you're implying there is that you think other people live their lives in a way that you don't really approve of, and you think it's silly, so we should do something differently. And it's a very important question as to how exactly we would change that. Now, I personally agree with you. When a lot of people I went to LA a couple of years ago, and there was a guy there, great guy. He went to every Rams game. He had season tickets. His whole family was there. And I thought to myself, heavens, why would you spend so much money on watching a sporting match? It was fun, right? But you wouldn't go every weekend. So yeah, I see people that do things and invest time into things that I think it's weird, right? But I wouldn't be the guy that says, oh, you're only doing that because society is forcing you to really like watching football, or you're only doing that for whatever reason, and I think you shouldn't be doing that, and I think you should change. And it's very dangerous territory when we start saying that everybody's values are being influenced wrongly by social fabric. We're getting into a dangerous territory where we're basically saying that, we're almost implying that our values are better than everybody else's. So there's a bit of caution on that. In terms of people paying their bills, I mean, I agree with you. I think it's really weird that someone earning $150,000 a year would always be paying their bills. But when you think about it, it's like, well, what else do you do with your money? Either you put it in the bank, or you spend it on stuff, or you can give it to people in need, or you can give it to people who other people who might benefit from it. And I think we need more people in society that do that want to give to people in need. But why don't they? Maybe it's because a lot of people think, well, the government's going to sort it out. We give a lot of tax to the government. Why isn't the government fixing the welfare system? Why isn't the government handling this? Why isn't the government doing more to help people out of poverty or whatever else? And so maybe people, they feel the responsibility lies elsewhere. Where they walk past a homeless person and they think, that guy's going to be getting the job seeker unemployment payment or whatever other payment. So, I don't need to step in or whatever else. So there's an element of that. You're right that people are sort of shirking a community responsibility, but it's not necessarily because they're obsessed by wealth. It could be because they think that there's a system bigger than them in the government that is going to be doing it. So yep, I understand that people can be impacted by the values of society, but we've got to be so careful when we say that people's values are wrong and that it all ought to be different. In terms of indigenous societies, let me be a bit of a smart ass here. So if we really think that indigenous societies were having a fantastic time for tens of thousands of years, does that mean we withdraw all of our resources out of those communities that are teaching literacy and working on healthcare and working on education? Or do we think that these, I guess, more modern things can benefit everybody? It's an interesting dichotomy there. So I know we've got to wrap up, and I agree with you guys about what you're saying about the well-being of people being important. I think every day you see examples in everything you do of people who can earn a profit or earn an income or earn something out of doing something for others, whether it be running a shop or whatever else, starting a business. You want to start a pizza shop, you have to provide people pizza. You're a hairdresser, you have to be the best, most competitive hairdresser. And people are incentivized to do that. And we have a good system that works to incentivize people for that. We've basically agreed that, I think, between us, that government is not good at doing those things. So the question is, what is the alternative? There's a lot of criticisms of capitalism tonight for being imperfect and because we haven't solved all the problems yet. But how the alternative going to work exactly? We've talked about how government allocations of capital can be really bad. It can actually be really dramatically terrible. A lot of examples of that from government banks. We've talked about how government does spend money on research that can be very successful, but it also spends money on a lot of stuff. And it's us that when the government allocates capital or when the government allocates money on research, it's us as citizens and taxpayers that are bearing the risk of that. And sometimes I wonder if these risks aren't really the responsibility of the government at all. Maybe they're the responsibility of people that want to try and earn a profit. So I've learned a lot about the thinking of people on the other side of the debate. So I'm glad that we had this discussion. But I think I've left you some questions to answer as we get towards wrapping up.
Yep, we have so far one. Before we get to that, first of all, thank you guys. This was great. I think I also learned a lot about it, different ways to look at it, flaws in government, flaws in capitalism, the whole concept of industrial society. I appreciated that framing. Before we go to questions, I'm going to give a shout out to one of my biggest supporters, Ophir. Thank you, Ophir. Ophir is one of the most active people on the Great Debate page. He's constantly telling me that I'm wrong and that I have bad arguments, but he has not yet explained why I'm wrong. So I'm with you, Ophir. You're my friend. I mean, I don't know you personally, but I appreciate that you're here. But you're gonna need to break it down to me if you want to convince me. I'm definitely open-minded to being wrong. I've been wrong in the past. It's very possible I've made a terrible argument today, but I'm gonna need to know why. And again, thank you for all the support, your continued support. Anyways, yeah, me and Ophir have a good complex relationship here on YouTube.
Very romantic.
Ecological damage was talked about, but wouldn't. So this is from Donkey Person. Ecological damage was talked about, but wouldn't capitalism be the best system to foster innovation that saves the environment? Let's try to keep responses to 2 minutes.
I'll give 1 minute response even. On the one hand, you're right. that it's going to be an amount of innovation that might come out of companies, but it's the profit motive that is driving the ecological catastrophe in the first place. So companies, i.e. groups of people working together to do things, have to be incentivized in ways that aren't the profit motive, because via the profit motive, the incentive is to take as much out of the planet as possible, sell it for profit, and worry about the long-term results of that and defer that off to another generation. So it's intrinsic to the system of capital that is destroying the environment. That's the real issue for me anyway.
Cool. Matthew?
Okay. Do you know, I reckon most of the, in fact, I don't even reckon. Oh, sorry, were you going to say something, Ado?
No. All you.
Okay. Most of the biggest polluters over the past however many decades are government-owned businesses, you know. Saudi Aramco comes to mind, which is a big, they're contributing to pollution. But when we say there's a profit motive, right, it's because people are buying their stuff. People want to have a car. So they're contributing something, right? Yes, there is an environmental impact from it, but they are contributing something because they're getting petrol into their car so they can drive places and do things, take their kids to sport or whatever else. So the profit motive is encouraging them to get oil out of the ground and use, and so society can use it to do things. That's good, right? There is a negative environmental outcome, and that is where government should step in, and that is where the government, I think, should levy a tax on emissions or a trading scheme or whatever else, rather than so many of the other taxes we got. There's so many other taxes that are bad that we can abolish and replace them with a tax on emissions. So the profit motive is doing its job. You want to drive your car, Saudi Aramco is providing you the oil to do it. Yep, there's room for collective action for the government to step in and make sure there's a price on carbon. And in terms of getting us out of the problem, you know, I just note that no, I think I'll leave it there. I think I've said earlier that there's lots of private businesses that are being incentivized to do green tech, to produce green energy, because increasingly consumers want it. Increasingly consumers are concerned about the environment. Consumers are becoming wealthy enough in the developed world because of capitalism. They're becoming wealthy enough that they can make choices and they can say, I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit in terms of my power bill in order to know that I'm having an impact on the environment. I'm willing to pay to buy power from a company which is greener, or I'm willing to go that extra mile to buy an electric car or put solar panels on my roof or whatever else. And so companies with the profit motive are responding to that. And so hopefully that answers the question, but I'm an optimist.
Cool. Great responses from both ends. One more question. Thank you for the question monologue. How can we best structure welfare to both help the right people as well as not disincentivize work? So we briefly touched on this. I'll just you know, summarize what we said on this, and then Matt and Yoram can respond. But you know, the idea of UBI, universal basic income, was brought up, and that may solve the problem, because universal basic income, it's income you get regardless of if you work or not. So it won't have the same amount of disincentivization as you would had you been paid only if you don't work. But feel free to build on that. Maybe there's some other ideas.
I just want to
two things. It's in the. Oh. No, you go. Sorry, I can't see you, so I don't know if you're about to speak. Apologies.
Yeah. No, you froze for a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, I'm a big believer in universal basic income, except that I'm not sure that income is the right way to do it. It might be a form of universal basic stuff, because I think that like when you grow up rich, there's certain things that you just don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about where you're going to sleep at night. You don't have to worry about that there's going to be food in the fridge. And if you get sick, you don't have to worry about how you're going to pay your hospital bill. And so you can start to go and take risk and do innovative, cool things. Now, if you don't have those things, some people still are able to, you know, quote unquote, overcome it. But they're generally exceptions. So like being provided with a base level of stuff will allow people to be a lot more creative and a lot more, this thing in here has been evolving for 4 billion years, and the things it can do are pretty spectacular and amazing. But if you have to worry about the sort of base level of Maslow needs, like where you're gonna sleep, what you're gonna eat, this thing can't do all of its amazing things. So, like, to me, some form of universal basic stuff is how you can free the 7 point whatever billion brains on the earth to really do what they're capable of doing, as opposed to like telemarketing in order to pay the rent, or even fancier jobs in telemarketing to pay mortgages. That if you just had somewhere to live, you wouldn't have to do those things. And it might disincentivize some, but I am quite optimistic that most humans wouldn't sit around and be lazy. In fact, it would generate like one of the greatest creative explosions in human history if people didn't have to worry about those basic needs. So that's how I see it, if that makes sense.
Okay. Two things. Firstly, to directly answer the question, I think it's all in the amount, and it's all in what you might call the taper. And again, I'm using an Australian example, but it's true in a lot of countries that if you have an unemployment benefit, or some other welfare benefit, there's some, if you leave the workforce, you have kids or something, you get a family tax benefit. There are circumstances where people will be economically worse off if they go out and get a job part-time than if they stayed at home after they have a child with their husband still at work. And there are circumstances where if you get offered a part-time job, for example, only part-time, you may only be a little bit better off than if you were on New Start allowance, because your unemployment benefit is going to be tapered away, usually at a very, very high rate. Usually it's 50 cents in the dollar. So if you earn like an extra $1 of income, your benefit gets taken down by 50 cents. So it's almost like a tax that you're paying. So it's not actually a tax, but it's the same impact as a tax. And people on very low incomes end up with these really, really high effective tax rates because of the way the welfare system is designed. So it's about the amount and the taper. Now, one of the challenges is to get an amount that everybody would be pleased about would be prohibitively expensive. But if you think about it right now, as I said, $180 billion a year, right, we're spending. So I'm sure there's a way that you can break that down so that everybody gets at least some minimum. And then if you tell people that that you won't taper that away just because they started earning an income, that's where the real benefit is. If you start having a welfare system where you don't immediately start penalizing people for getting a job, then that will encourage them to get a job, because then they can build on what they get rather than have what they got taken away as they get more from somewhere else. Just in terms of the universal basic stuff, I do prefer the idea of income because it allows people to pick. I don't want someone telling me what sort of stuff I need. And it might be that in my case, I might want to live in rent a smaller flat, one room in a small flat, and rather spend my money on whatever else. Some other people might have a garden, a backyard, or what have you. So I think giving people a basic income is good in the sense that they can make their own choices to what exact sort of lifestyle they want and how they want to spend the money. And there's a lot of ways you can extend this application. I think in a lot of Scandinavian countries, not that there's a lot, they use school vouchers, and it's been tried in other places in the world, and it's very successful. You give people, rather than the government controlling school spending, you actually give people the money directly, and you say to them, hey, you can choose the school that works for you at the right price and whatever else. And it has a fascinating positive impact. And I'm sure that can be applied to other things, potentially healthcare or whatever else, and social housing maybe as well.
Great. One last question. This one is for Yoram, but actually, just so I can be fair, Ophir says that I'm not always wrong, so I appreciate that. I don't only want to show the negativity. This is I need to bring it up in two. How do we incentivize the innovation that inevitably enables technological development without an excessive individual incentive that favors the innovators? So this is to you, Yoram. You mentioned that it's technology that has that has elevated humanity. But how do we maintain an incentive for innovators if they don't get to keep most of the wealth that is created from their innovation?
I'll say two things. The first one is I don't know. The second one is there's a concept I came across a couple of years ago called psychographics, where it's sort of like a sister discipline to demographics, where demographics breaks people down into age and gender and income brackets and etc. Psychographics breaks people down into psychological profiles. And it turns out from their research that not that many people are actually motivated by things like profit. That like more people are motivated by belonging to groups or by sort of not, well, I can't even remember all the categories now, but the idea that money or that profit is the only thing that motivates, I think is a limiting view. And like, if that was the case, humanity wouldn't have achieved the things that it achieved up until the advent of capitalism and that kind of thing. And I think, when we eventually hit a truly enlightened society that's post-money, there'll be like, the idea of just contributing to society will be the motivation. So like, I know that kind of sounds wishy-washy and weak, and I accept that off the bat. But yeah, so two answers. One, I don't know, and two is I just don't think money's the only thing that motivates innovation or people.
Yeah, I'll build on that. So I think we could find a hybrid. Yeah, sure. I'll just add. So I think we could have some kind of middle ground. I think innovators. Wait, hold on. I think innovators should be able to keep, and Yoram may disagree, but I think innovators should be able to keep a large amount of wealth to incentivize them. But I also think we should live in a society that values innovators. So you're not doing it just for the capital; you're also doing it for recognition. And we do live in a society like that. That people are motivated to do good, not only because they're going to make money, but also because they want to be appreciated for doing good. All you, Matt, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. All fair. I agree with both of you on this one, but I think, firstly, if I can be sneaky, the point about psychographics, let's apply that to the way the world works right now. Earlier on, there was a bit of a sense, I think, that people felt that the only motivation companies had was making profit, and that's why they delayed medications or whatever else. But you made the point that people are motivated by a lot of other stuff like helping the community and whatever else. So that's an incentive there that already exists in society. And secondly, I agree with you guys that people are motivated by more than wealth. But I think the challenge is that when you it's like when you start a business. Jeff Bezos, he's a really, really rich guy, supposedly. He's got billions and billions of dollars. But almost all of that is the value of his shares in Amazon. And it's very difficult. He doesn't care, right, I don't think, about having all of that money exactly. And when the share price goes up or down, that value will go up or down. It's like, it's not a real number. It's kind of an imaginary number. But I'm sure what he does care about is having 11% control of the company that he owns, because it's his baby, right? He's given so much to it, and he wants to set its direction in future. Andrew Forrest, who's an Aussie billionaire, he wants to control the company that he created because he wants to, he donates a lot to charity and all the rest of it too, but he wants to keep ownership of the company that he created because he wants to set its direction as well. And so by owning shares in a company, you might see that someone has a very high wealth. Andrew Forrest has $15 billion wealth. But in a practical sense, when that income actually comes into his bank account, most of it goes to charity or whatever else. So we often think about wealthy people as having lots of zeros after their name, but it's not really like that. What it's actually about is it means that it's just the value of the portion of a company that they control. And the company's value is, its brand, its servers in the case of Amazon, its warehouses, whatever else, or its mine sites or whatever else. So I think the real challenge when we talk about taking wealth away from really rich people is not just about how that impacts incentives. It's also about the fact that what you're effectively doing is you're taking someone's company away and you're taking their control of the company away. And that is an additional challenge on top of the economic incentive of having really high taxes or whatever else. I'm going to wrap up. Let me say, I've had a great time tonight, and isn't it fantastic to see people, even if we have different views, that really do passionately want to have a better society. And lots of people think that politics is debates between people that are selfish or whatever or not. And I think tonight we've seen that that this is really about trying to make a better society, and that's, I guess, what the Great Debate is all about. So hopefully we've helped viewers on that.
Amen, Matthew. I'm with you. It's been a great pleasure. Yoram, if you want to give any final words, all you.
Yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun. Yeah, I really appreciated both of you guys and what you've said. Yeah, I still feel that I didn't do justice to a lot of like the evil that is going on via capitalism in the world, but yeah, it'll have to wait for the next 2.5 hour session that we do. So yeah, no, it's been fun, and thank you for putting it together.
Yoram, we can definitely do this again, and you could hit more points. It'll be a pleasure. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much.
All right.
10 viewing. I'm gonna log you guys off now. Give a few final words to the audience.
Thanks.
That was great. If you guys want to get in touch with our guests, as I mentioned, their contact information is in the description. So please get in touch with them that way. They both do awesome work on the day-to-day. There's a lot of value in getting in touch with them. And as always, guys, it's been a pleasure. I'm always looking for feedback, tips on how we can make the Great Debate better. If there's a guest you'd like to see on the Great Debate, let me know. If there's a topic you'd like to see discussed, let me know. The strength of this channel is our effort as a community, and I truly appreciate all you have done up until now. Thank you, guys.